an introduction to Minnesota's public records universe. And we should go around the room.
Hi, I'm Brian with CARE, work on the news desk there.
Reed Forgrave, Star Tribune, Metro Desk.
Ricky Campbell, investigative producer with KSTP.
Tony Longtree, Star Tribune, Metro.
Renee Cooper, I new to the Twin Cities a few months ago with KSTP.
I'm Kristen Swanson. I'm an investigative reporter with KSTP.
Go ahead.
I'm Marshall Hoff, and I'm a Metro reporting intern.
Josie Alvinson Grove and Metro of the Star Tribune.
I'm a Star Tribune Metro reporting intern.
I'm Kathy Roberts. I'm one of the business editors.
Kevin Bertles, sports department. I lead the high school coverage.
Kim Hyatt, Metro reporter, Star Tribune.
Dave Orick, Metro reporter, Star Tribune.
And
you, Allie.
Allie.
Hello, I'm Allie Shaw, and I am a deputy Metro editor. Did we make it around?
I believe we did.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Don, you want to give a little your background, quick? He's got a long story.
In 1973, I got an assignment to staff a committee working on a data privacy law for Minnesota, which eventually morphed into the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act, which is the world's strangest Freedom of Information Act. And I spent, well, now I'm close to my 40th plus year of working with this stuff. I retired. Actually, Tim Palenti retired me in 2004. And I still stay active, helping people understand their rights, getting access to government information. I write, I teach, I do that kind of stuff. So.
Thank you.
And his phone number is on the tip sheet.
Yes.
Yep.
And I encourage, you got a weird thing, call me. The weirder the better. I love weird. So.
I am coming up on 18, well, I think I just passed it, at the beginning of April, 18 years of working in the Twin Cities and covering Minnesota. And because I work with data as a data editor, I ask for a lot of data. I usually have requests pending pretty regularly and become a bit of an expert thanks to people like Don and James and some other people that I've learned from over the years. So we have a jam-packed hour here for you, but that tip sheet that was on the link at the beginning, there's a link at the end, has all of this written down. So at least all the key things you're going to need. We're going to riff a little bit and we're going to give some examples. We're going to talk through some things toward the end. We'll start with an overview of what this is and kind of how it works. Do you want to talk about Chapter 13? Who does it apply to?
Chapter 13 applies to every government entity in Minnesota except the legislature.
Big awful.
And the courts.
Al, one more New York, and you're going to get my hand.
Interrupted discourse. That's how it works.
Yeah, that's what they do in New York. I hang around New Yorkers. Except the courts, the legislature, and little tiny townships. Big townships actually are subject to the Data Practices Act. So any school district, any city, any county, any watershed district. My favorites are the weed control folks, whom I once trained. And they have a lot of issues about weeds. So,
yep. And public colleges, but not private colleges.
Right.
And there may be some situations where a private entity, a business, might be subject if they have a contract with a government agency. So don't rule that out altogether either.
Exactly.
Those of you who work in the business department. So this is a big one. When and why you should use the DPA that I wanted to talk about. First of all, we frequently run into situations where agencies are not answering our questions, right? If they have that information stored in some sort of form, paper, database, something, they have to give it to us under the DPA. So we could probably get that information that way. It's also a way for us to get more detail than what we can get in the human interviews we do or in the published reports that we write about all the time. And in this day and age, and particularly where we are trying to distinguish ourselves digitally from all the noise that is out there, we need to distinguish ourselves, get away from just the press conferences and the reports that everyone has access to and go deeper. And that getting public records on a regular basis is the way to do that. And if you're a beat reporter, there are documents and data on your beat, especially if you're covering a government, a public agency that you should be getting all the time, even if it doesn't lead to a story right that minute when you get that document and that data. So this is not for projects and big things. We should be doing this every day. And go for
And
it.
often the data is stuff that the officials don't even know they have.
Yeah. Yep. I've worked with data that agencies had never really even looked at themselves before, and it's kind of crazy. So, Don, what does this look like in terms of like what could you possibly get from an agency? It's not just data in the way we understand data, right?
Well, part of what's different about our law is that it focuses on data, okay? Every time I see somebody write a line that says, I made a records request, I do
The word
weird things.
records, you cringe at the word records.
Yeah, I cringe at the word records because I won't give you all the history. When we were doing this, somebody realized that the world was going to become data, and it wasn't going to become just pieces of paper that we call records tucked in paper files, tucked in folders. So the statute really does focus on data. And I'll give you an example. You can have a document, we'll say paper, 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper, and it's got on the top an employee's name. This next thing down is their salary. The next thing down is when they started working there. And then the rest of it is all about what a terrible employee they are, okay? If you ask for data about that employee, you get the first three things because they're all public. You don't get the last thing because it's not public, okay? And that's all throughout government records, the intermix of data that's public and not public, okay? Just one thing. When I use the word not public, the Data Practices Act has 4 distinct classifications of data that aren't public, but the way we talk about all 4 of them without having to say all 4 of them is to say the word not public, okay? So one of the tricks of the trade is understanding, and MaryJo, this is one of her things, and I love one of her things. She talks about doing your homework before you make requests. And a big chunk of doing your homework is understanding how the government does stuff, okay?
We're going to get to that.
Yeah, so anyway, go ahead.
Generally, I mean, this is not written in the law, and Don disagrees with me on this terminology a little bit, but we should approach this as if all data are considered public unless otherwise exempted. That's the philosophy we should have as journalists. Don't just sit there and think, oh, there's no way that's public. Let them tell you that it's not public.
And cite the statute that says where it's not public.
And there's 2 things that I want you to take away. If you take nothing else away from this session, there's 2 things I want you to take away. This is the first one. The agency is responsible for proving and citing the specific statute in the law that you can't have it, that it's not public. You can't let them say, oh, that's not public, and you just walk away. You need to force them to give you the statute, because if we just let them say, oh, that's not public, we build in this culture like, those agencies could be like, we could just say it's not public and they'll walk away. And we can't let them do that. So get that statute and make sure you get it in writing.
Get it in writing, and remember, they have to tell you, okay? That part of the Data Practices Act says if you ask, you have to be told what statute makes the data not public, and you have to put it in writing. You do have to ask them to put it in writing, okay? And that's a key to all kinds of stuff.
But my best story on this, I asked for, the Minnesota Department of Public Safety keeps a database of all crashes, and fatal crashes, injury crashes, and major damage crashes. And I asked for it, and they told me it was not public. They said, cite the statute. They gave a clip of the statute and put it in an email. I went to chapter 13 and read the statute, and then right below the clip that they gave me was a line that says, an anonymized version of this data is available to the public. So I went and I read this actual statute, not just what they sent me as well. But then they came back and said it's going to cost $10,000. And I said, no, it's not going to cost $10,000. I got it for $35.
Wait, how do you do that?
We're going to talk about that later. So I did not walk away from them saying it was not public. I made them prove it. And then I went and read the statute and saw, yes, there is a way to get this, so you can get it. Don, you want to talk about your rights this is not media rights. This is public rights. Anybody in the public. What rights do we have?
Well, starting from there, you have an absolute right to inspect public data at reasonable times and places at no cost, okay? Every year for about the last 15 years, the government types have come in to try and get that changed because they hate it, okay? It costs them money, life is hard, it's been in the statute almost since the beginning, and it's one of the most important things in the statute, okay? Because if you want to go in and spend the time, and that's part of the problem, is the time thing, you have an absolute right to see all public data. And back to the example I used earlier, if there's a mix of public and not public data, they have to separate that, okay? And make the public data available to you. And again, inspection is free, okay? And that's part of inspection. So, okay, if you want copies, and this is where things get more difficult. If you want copies, they can charge you, okay?
What about taking a picture with your phone?
Well, we'll get there. You're not as German as some of the people in this room are. So we have to do this like this, you know. So anyway.
So right to be informed of the meaning of public data. They can't just hand it over to you and say, you figure it out.
Yeah, you know, if those of you who look at government stuff, it's full of acronyms. It's full of weird terms nobody else uses. And so part of why that's in the statute is if you say, hey, explain the content and meaning here. I don't get what this does. That's another thing they have to do. And when I say have to, these are all shall words in the statute, which in statutory interpretation means in English they have to do it, okay? So one of the things that was added not too long ago was there were some problems with people being essentially intimidated, okay? Well, why do you want this? And who are you, okay? And so the legislature actually added into the statute, you don't have to tell the government who you are when you ask for stuff, and that has some technical problems, obviously. And you definitely do not have to tell them why you want the data. Okay?
This is a tricky thing for us as journalists, because what I found is if you don't give them some indication of what you're doing, they assume the worst, and they think you're, out to get them or something. And I find that if you give at least some, for example, our big project on sex assault cases, denied justice, we asked for data from 26 law enforcement agencies, and especially the little ones were kind of like, what? You're asking for all this data from us? And we calmed them down by saying, you are one of 26 that we're talking to. And then they were like, whew. And even not saying exactly what we were going to do with it, but just, we're getting this from 26 agencies and we're planning to look at all of these together, helped assuage that. And so you don't have to tell them why. And generally we often have to tell them who, and it actually sometimes comes to our advantage in the media to say who we are. But the why, you can slide out of that.
Back to Hal's question. There are some things the statute doesn't answer, okay? And then you really come down to what kind of agency you're dealing with, whether or not they're, for lack of a better word, user-friendly, and what kind of relationship you have with them. And the thing that Hal commented on, can you bring your phone in and take pictures, which seems to be the logical thing to do because it doesn't cost them anything. Some agencies will say yes, and some agencies will say no, okay?
I've managed to take a scanner in and scan pages of documents at some places, but some are reluctant and they're like, you want to use our electricity?
Yeah, MaryJo and I emailed back and forth about being charged for electricity, which people have tried to do.
Yeah.
Okay. So.
All right, so the government, though, this is the one that sticks in my craw every day. They're required to maintain public records in a way that is easily accessible. On the data side, I think they're all breaking the law, almost all, because they don't seem to make it easy to export a vast amount of database data that I like to work with. And this is one thing I'd love to see MNCOGI take up someday, but it's a big fight. There's not much we can do to hold them other than remind them of this, right? There's nothing more we can do other than say this is, and those is easily accessible in the law.
Oh,
Oh, it is.
that
All
part of
over.
the law has been in existence since before I was born,
Wow. Okay, well.
i.e. 1941.
Now the next thing is they're supposed to receive and comply with our requests in an appropriate and prompt manner. But there is no definition of time.
No.
Which is probably one of the biggest failings of the DPA, in my opinion.
Oh, it is. It is. Yeah, it's one of the things that MNCOGI does is we go to the legislature, not every year, but most years, and try and get improvements. And we've tried the time improvement, and we run into the government associations. And so typically it's 3 of us sitting in a room with 20 government lobbyists saying, oh, no, that's going to cost us millions of dollars. We can't do that. Okay.
So an example of our experience here wasn't my team, but I understand that someone who asked for multiple police reports, just public data on 1382 from Minneapolis police, took 8 months for them to get those collective reports. Whereas you can go to the public service center and get one printed out or, pulled up on the computer right then. But if you're asking for multiple, Abby might know more about this. If you're asking for multiple reports, it's ridiculous. I mean, but it's like, I sort of feel like we could take that case to the administration commissioner and just say,
DPA.
I think that also violates the easily accessible clause. Like what I hear from those agencies is it's a staffing issue. We don't have the people to do it. Well, then now you've not made it easily accessible.
Right.
So.
Yeah, one of the problems is the easily accessible language is not in the data practices.
Oh, it's not, okay.
It's in a different statute. Okay. It's in an old statute.
About public government records.
Yeah, it was our original public records law.
Okay.
But a few months ago, a district court, and frankly, I can't remember where, actually said that even though that provision isn't in the Data Practices Act, you can use the Data Practices Act to sue about it. Okay.
I use that other statute.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, because the other statute doesn't have a remedy.
Yeah.
So, and in that particular case, what it meant is they had to pay attorney's fees because they hadn't made things easily accessible. So
Your tax dollars at work.
Yes.
We're going to talk about costs more in depth, so I'm going to save that one. If the data is maintained in some electronic format, and that is what you ask for, they need to provide it in that format. So for example, I often ask for things that I would expect I could get like in a spreadsheet, and they send me something in a PDF. Well, I asked for it in a spreadsheet, you have to give it to me in a spreadsheet. Same thing with if there's an electronic PDF of a report or a document or something, and you want a PDF, they have to give, and you ask for the PDF, you have to get the PDF, and they can't, if they try to give it to you on paper, you're like, no, that's not what I wanted. They have to give it to you. So this kind of goes back to that initial thing that this applies to all government data, audio, video, paper, data, spreadsheet kind of things, all of that. Whatever format it exists in on their end, we should be able to get the comparable thing. All right, so a couple of things that journalists run up against frequently is agencies are not required to create new data. So let's say an agency has data on every bill or invoice that it paid, but they don't have something that summarizes all of that by type. And you ask for a summary of all the bills that they've paid by what it was, the categories it was for. If they don't have it, they're not required to make that for you. We find, though, a lot of agencies will do it, but they're not required to. And so if they tell you, no, we're not required to, we're kind of stuck. It's, this is a situation where we got to use our carrots and be like, please, and try to get them to it.
Can I just interrupt? Sorry. Isn't there a reception for summary data?
Yes. So that's kind of my last point here is so we run into this with like Department of Human Services a lot, right? That a lot of the stuff they have is not public because it's very sensitive, health-related information and such. Those are situations where they are required to make summary data available, but they are also allowed to suppress it to ensure someone is not not identified. So for example, toward the beginning of the opioid epidemic, I asked for some data related to people receiving drug treatment. And I asked for just how many, I think it was how many people by race in each county.
Yeah.
Yes.
And if there were fewer than 3 people in one of those cells, they redacted it. And I'm like, how am I going to find 3 Black people in St. Louis County? But they're allowed to do that. So you'll see something like that. We also can't use DPA to ask a question. So you can't write a DPA and say, how much did you spend on toilet paper last year? No, you'd have to ask for what invoices or documents do you have and produce that shows how much you paid for toilet paper last year. That's a stupid example, but you get the point. So the framing of that wording is super important, and we will talk about that in a second. Don, some areas that we routinely run into where we have trouble, right? Or that it's just not public.
Oh, I mean, some areas. This is the Data Privacy Act. Okay.
When it started, though, how many pages was it? Wasn't it like just
It was 9.
9.
Yeah, but that was before the presumption that all government data are public, except, okay.
199 pages.
Oh, you added a few because there's more in here than that.
Okay.
When this started, there were essentially 2 ways to go at making these decisions. One was the Freedom of Information Act approach, where you lay out broad exemptions, invasion of personal privacy, national security, all that kind of stuff. And then the courts sort out what that means, okay? So if you look at the Federal Freedom of Information Act, you'll find that the actual law is about like this, because that includes all the case law. So the decision was made here, no, we don't want to do it that way. We want the legislature to make all of these decisions, okay? And that's how we get this, okay? Because every year some government agency has some data they think ought to be not public. As a matter of fact, right now we're working on an issue with the legislative auditor who wants a whole bunch of stuff to be not public that's been public for 40 years, okay? And they come in and they make their pitch to the legislature. Most of the time in recent years, they win, okay? And so that's an example of the kind of things we're talking about, okay? But I counted one time, and in the statute itself, you could identify 600 different types of data that weren't public, okay? If you went back and tried to categorize them, they more or less reflected a freedom of information exemption kind of thing. It's just it was more detailed, okay? But then, in addition to what's in here, there are another 200 or 300 statutes in the bulk of Minnesota statutes that also classify data as not public. So those are the kind of things that we find the public and particularly journalists are most often interested in, okay? And at that point, you know, to look at each of them, you have to get into some of the detail.
Yep, and we are going to get into a couple of them.
Yeah.
Okay, so my second key point that I want you to remember from this 1 hour is you need to put on your reporter hat before you write your request. Don't just fire off a request and hope that it's going to work. You need to have an understanding of what it is you're asking for. Does that agency have some terminology that they use, a name for it? What might be in this data, whether that's paper, audio, video, databases, whatever, what might be in there, what's not in there, just put your reporter hat, ask questions. One of the things I've had a lot of success with in the last few years, particularly with state agencies, has been to ask them for a meeting in advance. Say, I am planning to file a public records request for data related to blah, 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 blah. I really do not understand what I'm asking for, and I really would like to make this process as smooth and painless for everybody. Could your data people or anyone who's knowledgeable about this topic meet with me to help, tell me, and this is an off-the-record meeting. I'm not quoting you. This is just for my knowledge and to help make this process go smoother. And these state agencies are quite happy to do that, and it has been quite successful. And we've had a little bit of luck with we met with MPD for the Denied Justice Project. That helped as well. So I'd like to start working on the lower agencies now and get them to do this as well. Be willing to, meet up front. Because I would say 99% of the problems that I've troubleshooted in my years, either here at the Pioneer Press, were due to not doing this homework in advance. They could have been avoided. Especially if you're getting data like I do. So this is one of my examples from the Pioneer Press. A reporter, without telling me or anything, just filed. There was a bunch of people who had had their license. They'd gotten in trouble for neglecting or abusing foster care children, and she wanted to see how big of a problem it was, right? So she asked for all data on all individuals whose foster care license had been suspended or revoked in the past, I think it was 5 years, including their names, addresses, date obtained the license, date license suspended or revoked, and the reason for the revocation suspension. The agency just freaked out, told her it would cost like $5,000, and it would take many, many weeks for them to do that. And she came to me just flummoxed, like, what do I do, right? We asked for a meeting after the fact. And they had like 10 people on the call, and it was me and her on the other end of the call. And this is before video times. We were on like phone. And they kept talking about how hard this was going to be, and it's just going to take so long. And finally, I'm like, why is it going to be hard? Well, finally, someone said, the reason for the revocation and suspension is only stored in paper records. We don't have a field in our database that has that. So we'd have to go into all the paper records and add it to the data, which is making new data, which they're not required to do, but they felt like they had to do it, and they were going to charge us for the time to do that. All wrong. But think about if she had called the agency and said, is all this in your database? Ask one simple question, all of that would have been avoided. And once they told us that, and then we said, well, what if we asked for everything but that reason? Oh, we can have that to you this afternoon, no cost. So homework, be a reporter. So your request should be submitted to the responsible authority. Don, who is that?
Yeah. Under the statute, it's the person in the agency who's supposed to be in charge of handling data issues, okay? And who it is varies from agency to agency. In cities and counties, except for elected officials, it's whoever the city council or the county board appointed to be the responsible authority. In state agencies, it's the head of the agencies. In a school district, it's whoever the school board appointed. So it really does depend on, but part of what the statute says is they're supposed to have publicly available information either on their website or on a piece of paper posted in City Hall that says who the responsible authority is. And the reason in part for this, the game that sometimes gets played is you made all kinds of legitimate requests to the person you would think you should be dealing with, the person who's in charge of a given functioning in the government, and things go to hell. And you go back and your lawyer says we're going to sue them, and the agency's defense is you didn't make your request to the responsible authority, which is what the statute says you have to do, and therefore you lose. And I've dealt with 3 of those.
And you do lose.
And you do lose.
And you do lose.
Yeah.
So if I could jump in here, the responsible authority is the person with whatever government agency is likely to be the smartest one on the law. So really you want to get to that person because they're not going to play these games with you. It's like, well, it's under investigation, so there's nothing that's public in this. It's like, well, that's just not true. But the responsible authority is your best chance of reaching someone who actually knows what they're talking about with data practices and can exercise. And in some cases, like I had a very positive experience with the Metro Transit's, or the Met Council's responsible authority recently, where she was like, oh yeah, and I didn't even identify myself as a reporter because I wanted to see how a regular person would be treated. And she was great. She went to the Metro Transit police. It was like, oh, you're talking to the wrong person. This is the person you need to talk to. And so if you find that person, they may well be your best advocate.
And if you do have to go, if they want you to go through a PIO, maybe CC this responsible authority as well. And remember that responsible authority could be your backstop too if the PIO's running you around. So there's a lot of agencies starting to use data request portals. The city of Minneapolis is the big one, instead of email. And if that's the way you have to go, regardless of whether you're doing email, paper letters or this data portal, make sure you keep a paper trail, like print out the emails like to true paper or to PDFs or something, so that you have every step of the conversation, even if you think that this will go easy. Because what if it doesn't? If you get down the road and you didn't save any of that, then you don't have the trail for the ways to fight the denial, which we're going to talk about in a minute.
I have a question about the portal.
Yeah.
They often ask for information that's not required. They'll have a little asterisk for the required stuff. Do you recommend adding the stuff that's not required?
Well, it won't let you submit the form if you don't fill out the required fields, so we're kind of in a jam there.
Yeah, how about the unrequired fields?
If it's not required to get it through, I don't see how.
Often that's your name and.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like I said, I think as journalists, we should be upfront with the agencies about what we're doing, and we're probably, I think government officials appreciate us being transparent, because we want them to be transparent too. So I think we should.
One of the problems with the portals is they give the opportunity to give different people different treatment.
Yeah.
The St. Paul portal asks whether or not you're making a request as a citizen or you're making a request as a member of the media.
Well, I think that ends up who handles it on the other end, but yeah.
Well, but still, you and I both know.
We hear a lot of stories from average citizens that they get treated way differently than we do. Way, way differently. So let's talk about reasonable time.
Tim had a question on
Yeah.
that.
What's the question?
Who wants to know, if you're using one of the portals, how do you know your request is going to the responsible authority?
If you're using one of the portals, how do you know your request is going to the proper authority? Gosh, I don't know. You could probably email the responsible authority separately and say, did my request come through?
That's what I do.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Are they justified in forcing us to go through the portal? In other words, we're not going to accept an email? You have to
I think what you said earlier, Don, is that they're required to provide some guidance about how the process works. And if they've laid out that that's what their process is, then it should be within the law, right?
Dave, it's something I hope somebody sues about. Okay. Because the portals basically ask you to provide your name. And even though it may have a little tiny asterisk that says this isn't required, your process, your request is going to be handled differently. Okay. And the other problem with the Data Practices Act is we need to rework it because of the new technology. Okay. But so far we haven't found anybody who really wants to jump into that. So.
In Minneapolis, I found that it's actually helpful to do both, because for the 3rd precinct story where we got financial records and response time data, excuse me, Asper with City Comms got me financial records that I never would have gotten through the portal. It would have taken 6 months. He got them to me in 4 days. So I went through him and I said, I'm happy to also put this in the portal, but I'm running a story on Sunday. And so it would be preferred if I know this exists already, so please give it to me. And he helped me do that. So.
Nice. Don, let's talk a little bit more about reasonable time. There's nothing in the law that says how much time they have to respond, but there are some commissioner opinions that have kind of laid some expectations. What are those expectations?
The legal fallback to any use of the word reasonable is you got to look at all of the facts and circumstances of a given situation to decide whether or not something is reasonable. Okay. So if you go in and you say, I'd like to look at the email the mayor sent on April 26th to blah, blah, that ought to be able to be turned around in about 10 minutes. Okay. That's reasonable. If you go in and say, I want to look at all the emails that the mayor sent between X date and Y date that contain the word racial bias, then you're going to have a longer period of time, and that's going to be reasonable. So the extremes really illustrate where there are problems. This case that Renee covered in St. Paul, the guy is asking for just straight up stuff. Give me copies of internal discussions of the possible effect of putting a bike path on Summit Avenue, and he's been waiting since July. Okay. Wow. Oh yeah. That's
beyond reasonable.
That's unreasonable.
For data stuff, spreadsheet stuff, I have a kind of general rule of thumb in my head of 3 to 6 months max, and I start freaking out after about 3 months, I think. All right, so let's talk about writing a good request. We're 40 minutes in. Okay, so you want to have a very specific listing of what you want, including the big thing that I think a lot of people forget is the universe of information you want. Over what period of time, including all things between that of this or not. So for example, I frequently ask for data on gun violence from the police department. Well, they come back at us and say, well, what, these are all the different things we count as gun violence, a shot spotter incident, a report of a gunshot happening, a murder, like there's all these different things. Well, what of those things do you want? And there's always going to be a universe, unless you're asking for like one document that has, a report that has a specific name on or something. But if you want, a lot of things, a lot of pieces of paper, a lot of data, there's going to be a universe that you need to give them to. If you are asking for data, spreadsheet kind of things, do not use the word list or the word report or records. Those are avoid all those records, I think, unless you truly are asking for something that is a report. Don't use these words. So for example, I'm looking for all reports of gun violence. I find I tend to turn on my wordy self in my data practice request and like explain as thoroughly in as many different ways with more than one sentence possibly to ensure that my point gets across. Because in addition to the homework thing, the other thing I find derails things is an agency misinterpreting your data, your request. So for example, let me talk about, I'm gonna give you an example in a sec. So ask to either inspect the data or get copies, and then what format you want. So Eric Roper was asking for dispatch data from police departments, and he told them he wanted a CSV file, which is comma separated values. You can open it up in a spreadsheet, right? And they started telling him, well, this is going to take us so long because we're going to have to do separate chunks, 60,000 records at a time, and it's going to take 10 chunks. And we're like, what? They assumed he was going to use it in Excel. And Excel can only handle about, well, it used to be 65,000 rows. It's not anymore. But they just assumed that he couldn't put the whole big file in Excel. And he wasn't going to use Excel. He was going to use a big database program. So I tend to like say, I want a CSV file and I'll be working with it in Excel. Or I want I know this is a really big file and I have a SQL Server database that I'm going to work with it in. Like really being elaborate, especially on the data end of what you want. Paper stuff is a lot easier to deal with, obviously. But then the copies, how are you going to transfer it to you? How are they going to get it to you? Talk about that. And then there's some phrases here I've got for you. If any or all of this request will be denied or redacted, please notify me in advance, in writing, including the specific DPA citation that categorizes this information as not public. Then you also want, now this is another one that reporters have been tripped up on. I've had reporters get screwed into paying a $500 fee because they didn't put this sentence in. If there will be any cost, please provide a written estimate in advance of filling my request. This is just boilerplate. You should just put it in there, those last two sentences every time. Request a fee waiver since you're a journalist working on behalf of the public. If you have a particular deadline, like Liz just mentioned in her example, ask nicely for them to get you the data by a particular date. I'm also increasingly finding agencies seem to want a deadline. They seem to be eager to like know that they need to do this within a particular time. So give them a deadline.
Like good journalists.
Yeah. And then, provide your contact information, ask them to contact you with any questions. I'm open to a meeting, an additional meeting. Hopefully you've already had one, an additional meeting to talk more about this. If you have any confusion, make sure that's all in there. Anything else did we miss?
A very useful phrase in making a request is all data documenting X, whatever it is you're interested in. An example, the hullabaloo about whether or not light rail is destroying the foundation of some condos over here. A media person asked for the report from Socotec, the company that went in and it went in and looked at the basement. And the response from Metropolitan Council was, there is no report. Okay. So they spent a whole bunch of money and they went over and they said, there's no report, even though we're blaming age for what's happening. Well, a citizen in the neighborhood who I've been working with has now sent in a request for all data in which the word Socotec appears, including invoices, emails, et cetera, and she's just been offered 3,300 documents.
Yeah. But so that's the slippery slope we have, is like you have to be specific, but not too specific. And this is where the homework comes in play, if you can. The Socotec example is tough because they don't want to play ball. They're going to be hard, but it is finding that sweet spot between too much and not enough. Okay, so let's go. A lot of you wanted to know about the cost. How did I get $10,000 down to 35? So the key thing is that you have to understand how this process works. And if you're dealing with paper, it's really straightforward. 100 or fewer black and white pages is no more than 25 cents per page. So they just literally add up the pages. They can't charge you for any time redacting, blacking out things, or whatever time they do on that. But what they're essentially, so with the paper copies, it's just that 25 cents per page, right? They can't charge you any additional human time for the searching and the retrieving.
No, not for the 1 to 100.
Okay.
No, it's 25.
But once it goes above 100, then a search and retrieval fee, which is based on an hourly rate of the person doing the work, right?
The least expensive person.
The least expensive person.
Plus the argument that, wait a minute, you're supposed to have this easily accessible.
Yes.
So how come you're telling me it took 30 hours to give me 10 pieces of paper?
Yes.
Okay.
If you're talking about data, the world I live in, it is the hourly rate of the lowest paid person capable of doing the work. And I did run into this with Ramsey County one time, where the head of the IT department ran the query, wrote the query, and it was her. She did the work, but she did charge me at the lowest paid person in her department who could have done the work. But these get a lot trickier, and if you are asking for data, this is where you want to get help from somebody who does know this stuff and has experience with it, because I could give you a bunch of guidance today, and you'll encounter something entirely different tomorrow. So the bottom line is you want them to give you that estimate of why they think it's going to cost $10,000, and that's what I did with that $10,000 one. Well, why is it going to cost $10,000? And why is it exactly 10,000, right? No, interestingly, the second thing that came back is, oh, we were incorrect. It's going to be $500. And so I see 2 zeros at the end of something, a rounded number like that, and I immediately know they did not do the hourly rate of the lowest paid person capable of doing the work, right? And then the other thing is, well, what are you doing? Generally, if you're going to pull something out of a database, it's just a matter of writing a little bit of code and then running it and spitting it out. And that should not take more than an hour for a person who knows the data. And if the data is easily accessible, it shouldn't take more than an hour. And an IT person today, what are we talking? Probably $80 an hour is where we are. My rule of thumb used to be 50. I think with inflation, I got to bump that up. If they throw me a number that's more than 50, 80, definitely more than 100, that's where I start to flip out and be like, I don't think so. Explain a little bit more and keep going.
What sort of power do you have in that? Like, can they just say we're charging $250 an hour, and you're like, that's unreasonable? They're like, no, it's not.
So that's where you can ask for that estimate of how are you? Okay, so you're going to take 3 hours to do it. What is this person doing in those 3 hours? Explain to me. And what I find is a lot of those agencies can't explain it. And then they realize, oh shit, we can't do that because we can't itemize what they're doing in those 3 hours. And so then you've got them up against a wall at that point. So does that help? Yeah. And there are some, we're going to talk about commissioners' opinions in a minute. There are some quite a few actually that have handled this topic. And you can fire off a response that says, according to this commissioner's opinion, blah, blah, and you just cite it. It almost always works. A couple of miscellaneous advice. I already said keep a paper trail. You might need it if you have to fight it. Send occasional emails. Don't wait for 3 months to not hear from them. I have frequently found agencies suddenly are like, oh crap, I forgot about that. Let me get to, or there's been times where I've done a check-in, like maybe I waited 2 or 3 weeks, which is maybe too long. And I do a check-in and they're like, oh, here's the data. I'm like, really? Just today? Is that coincidence? Really? So, and then get on the phone if they're not responding to your email. Now maybe this is my number 3 thing. Get the data even if your deadline is passed. If this means going to an agency and getting the paper copies that you requested, and even if the story is dead and you're not doing it anymore, go get it. We do not want agencies to think, oh, we can just wait and they'll never come and we don't need to fill this request. So go get it. And you never know. It's possible that maybe that it didn't work out for that story, but something might happen 2 or 3 months from now and you'll be like, oh, I have all that data. This is super useful. So fighting a denial. First step, Don, what is it? They say no. What do you do?
Get the citation of the statute that allows them to say no, okay? In some cases, they may cite a federal law and, for example, student records. But that's the key to any further discussion. And it's also the key to what might turn into a lawsuit, okay? And oftentimes, psychologically, when they're told you have to tell us what statute makes it not public, then they go, well, maybe we were wrong, okay? And I've seen that many, many times, okay?
And if they say chapter 13 and stop there.
No, specific citation to the statutory section that makes the data not public.
And at that point too, this is where you might also discover they misinterpreted your request or that you didn't ask for a broad enough thing. Ask them to explain, because it could be any number of reasons that they're saying no. I find agencies sometimes just say no in hopes that I'm going to go away. So the Data Practices Office is a wonderful, helpful thing. So this is rare. A lot of states don't have this. Anybody can ask for an opinion from the Commissioner of the Department of Administration about an issue with data practices. And you don't have to be, and the open meeting law. And the open meeting law. And you don't have to be a lawyer to write one. Although at the start review, the rule here is we have to go through our lawyer. And I would advise if you can go through a lawyer, be helpful. Don, what do those opinions do and how binding are they?
The ability to get an opinion is one of the many attempts we've made to make the Data Practices Act more enforceable than it is, because ultimately you got to sue. So opinions have, okay, at the bottom line, if you get a favorable opinion and you end up going to court, the judge has to give the opinion deference, okay? That's an administrative law concept that says basically, you know, Judge, we know you're smart, but this agency knows a lot more about this than you do, okay? Oftentimes, getting a favorable opinion from the commissioner embarrasses them, so they'll change what they're doing, okay? And then that often happens in the process of getting an opinion, because the commissioner says to both parties, tell me what this is about, and the agency has the opportunity to justify what it's trying to do, and then the commissioner gets to pick it apart. Or it's actually the munchkins who work for the commissioner. So
judges often, or how frequent does it happen where judges will disregard, will go their own way?
Sometimes they can, and they will. My favorite one of the first times an opinion went before a judge, in big letters she said, I don't have to follow this commissioner's opinion. And then the whole rest of her order and her logic was almost word for word what the opinion said. But she protected her status. So one of the things that the office is doing these days that I disagree with is they're now saying often, well, we already issued an opinion on that. Look at opinion X, Y, and Z. And the problem with that is it doesn't give you the advantage of taking it if you have to take it further along the way, because then now you're in an entirely different legal stream. So. But the opinions are online. Part of what your homework can be is say, is there an opinion on the cost of copies? And you can look that up.
The DPO also has a monthly newsletter that goes out by email that summarizes their recent opinions and recent case law.
If you go to this advisory opinions link on their website, it's indexed, and so they have like these categories. They can find things, and The people who work there are also helpful. If you're really, really stuck, they would point you to things, and I've had great luck with them. So Don, we have 10 minutes. We have a whole bunch of examples. How fast can we move through these? We thought law enforcement data is such a huge one, and there's a lot of misinterpretations, not only in the media, but also by the law enforcement agencies themselves about what is exactly public. There's stuff that is public immediately after an incident happens. First one being request for service data. Do you want to talk about that?
In the negotiation about law enforcement data that occurred many, many years ago, part of what was agreed to is the public access to law enforcement data had to be at a very detailed level, or there'd be endless fights. So the Data Practices Act sets up 3 categories of law enforcement data and says very clearly that the data within each of those categories, and it's at the detailed level, it's things like names of agency personnel participating in a police action, are public, and they're public even though an investigation of the underlying criminal action is still going on. And one of the abuses I've seen growing lately is public data. What you'll get is, well, the investigation is still active, but the statute very clearly says the stuff that's public is public no matter what the investigation status is. The best example I can give you is, and I haven't noticed it, I still don't know the name of the guy who killed the deputy in Polk County. Does anybody here know that?
I don't think we've seen that come out yet.
They released it.
They did?
Yeah, no, it was,
Okay.
When did they release it though?
3 or 4 days later.
Yeah, okay. It was public, at the moment they put it in a report, okay?
Well, that's one of the things I've run into is that they'll just say, we don't have that report made yet. Because they're not, what you're asking for is a request for service data, so it has to be something that's already on a report, not just a PIO telling you the name of that person. It has to be in writing. So are they violating the DPA by not making that report immediately, or lying to us saying it doesn't exist?
Oh, but now we've moved into the wonderful world of data. Somebody sent an email saying the guy who got killed was.
Oh.
Okay.
That data exists.
The officers who responded to that from our department were blah, okay? And that's public data.
And I should be able to get that immediately upon request.
Mm-hmm.
I would, yeah.
So the section 13.82 is one that you should bookmark and
Memorize.
carry a copy of with you. Memorize it, because you can literally hand it to them and say, look, here's all the things you are supposed to give me immediately, and has nothing to do with this investigation being active.
Memorize and/or carry it with you.
Yep.
And it's in the tip sheet.
Yep.
And if you run into somebody who says, well, I'm not so sure about that, this has been the law in Minnesota since 1979.
Yeah.
Okay?
So
and I have trained thousands of cops at a detailed level. Okay? I can't be responsible for what's happened in the last 10 years, but cops got a lot of training on this.
Yeah.
And they ought to know it.
So think about request for service data as like an incident has happened, police have been called to the scene, boom, that is a request for service. Then you get to response or incident data, which is their documentation of them going to that scene and what they did there and who was there and all of that. This one may temporarily be withheld. There's a little bit of a caveat. If the safety
evade detection or escape. That's the exception.
A perpetrator is fleeing and
Yeah.
Okay, but
and if you ask, they have to give you a statement that they're doing that and why they're doing it.
Why they're doing it in writing, I assume.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Definitely.
And then the third level is arrest data. They've arrested someone. There has to be some documentation related to arresting that person, incarcerating that person, or otherwise substantially depriving an adult. Now, this is only adults, does not apply to juveniles. And that is also public at all times, no matter if an investigation is active. This one, I think we have been a little easier time with, I think, right, than the other two, but still it's there.
You can't get limited data on kids.
Yeah, limited data.
Yeah.
Now, investigative data, like the narratives that the detectives write up, or the full investigation file is not public until the case is closed. So that is a tough one. Like with the Jacob Wetterling case, we just, that took 28 years.
28 years.
And they were great. They did make that all public, and that was wonderful. But
the Weatherlings try to stop it from being
that
public.
is true, yes.
That was a mess.
But a lot of other cases are held as open for a long, long time, even if, for various reasons. And what is the definition of
The
open?
only reason
Perhaps.
that something could be kept open for a very long time is it involved a homicide.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, those are the ones we're usually interested in. The homicides and the rapes and that kind of thing.
Yeah, because what triggers an investigation becoming inactive and makes most of the data in the investigation public is the agency decided not to do anything, and they have to document that. The statute of limitations ran for the underlying offense, and the third one, I can't remember what the third one is.
Like a court outcome.
Oh, yeah.
Like the
It
perpetrator
went to court.
is, yeah,
Thank you, Chris.
is either acquitted or found
Yep.
guilty.
Mhm.
Another section of the statute you should have a copy of, 13.43, is personnel data. And I just copied and pasted in just the basics of all the things you can get regarding a government employee. There's a ton in there. Go read it. Once you get into disciplinary data, there's lots of caveats, and I've just put a couple up here. But there is ways to get some of this disciplinary data, and you just have to be in the right place at the right time. And this is one where you get a little help. Do not just walk away and not get it. I want to quick ask about this one. We run into this very often. A city is producing a report, and they've circulated a draft copy among city council members, but they won't give it to you. Should they be giving it to us?
Absolutely.
They say it doesn't qualify as an official government document, but it is because they've created it, right?
You and I had this discussion. I had to take the word official out of everything.
Okay.
Because there's no official here.
It's just any government data.
If you look at the definition of government data, it has two sides. One is the physical side. It's all of the, it's pictures, paper, computer stuff, et cetera. But then to buttress that, to make sure that things are public, it also says data or government data if the government creates it, collects it, et cetera. Okay. That's, at the core of the Data Privacy Act, that's one of the most important things. And then one of the things that it does is it kills any idea that something is a draft. Okay, there can be drafts, but doesn't change the fact they're public.
Yeah.
Been created.
Yeah. All right. So the deck has some more links for you. There's the tip sheet and this deck, Don's phone number, my email, questions. We have like 2 minutes, but I'm happy to stay longer if need be. Questions. Yes.
I have one about redactions. I think I've used your boilerplate language before and been, cite the statute you're using to redact this, but I'll still get this hugely redacted data request saying it's personnel data or something, and I can't see what's redacted enough to fight it.
Can you ask them what the general things, like the labeling of what they hid? So they hid a disciplinary action, they hid this, without saying exactly what it is they hid. You can, is there any standing with the DPA to force them to tell you that?
I just feel like they're redacting too much.
Yeah.
Oh, they are.
They are. It helps to understand, and this is the tough part, this is the homework part that MaryJo emphasizes, to get a sense of how they do things, okay? And that helps you figure out whether or not they're redacting too much. If you've got a mixed bag of whatever you're dealing with, and they just tell you it's all personnel data, then that's not going to be right. Okay, there's something else going on. But at some point, you just have to figure out some way around that.
Maybe the other thing is to look at the things that are public and make sure you're seeing them in what you asked for. Because maybe that is one of the things that's, if it's not there, maybe that is one of the things redacted. Mm-hmm. And if you're going for disciplinary data, maybe ask for all this other stuff too, to kind of hold them accountable. Like, this is all the stuff you have to give me, and hope to God they.
Well, this is also one area of Data Practices Act which is actually pretty strong. In they have to tell you if they fired somebody that they were fired, and that here's the reason they were fired, and then the data behind it. And it's at the data behind it where they usually don't give it to you. So, well, we told you we fired them for misconduct. It's like, that's not enough. You have to give us the underlying data. And if the underlying data is a big blank page, then that's not fulfilling the law. That's how I would see it.
Yeah, if it's a page with a lot of data saying Schmedlap did this, but it says Schmedlap did this to so-and-so, that might be redacted properly. Okay, so.
Josie, any questions from online?
Yes, Janet wanted to know if there are DPA dockets somewhere that show requests that have been filed by other people. I think like the federal FOIA has something sort of similar to
Yes,
some
FOIA
agencies.
Well, in the portal, Minneapolis, you can see the other people's requests. You can also file a DPA asking for what everyone else has asked for. That's a fun little trick on your competitors.
I think Minneapolis might be the only agency in the state that does that, where you can look at other people's requests. I'm not.
Oh, no, St. Paul.
St. Paul does too?
Really?
Okay.
Yeah.
How do you do that?
I can't remember now, but
From the portal.
I figured it out pretty easily.
It'll tell you how many requests are pending, and then you can look at them.
No, Jim, I was doing another presentation. I went on the St. Paul portal and I asked to see their policies and procedures on how to get access to government information. And the first thing that came up was a request for government information from Rich Neumeister.
Okay. You'll find a lot of those.
Also, for purposes of redactions, if you know there's another agency that might be involved, you can also ask them, and then you can, you might even get some of the same documents with less redaction.
The MNCOGI website under Gemberling handouts has a sample request letter, okay? But it's a letter. You'd have to redo it for online. It's based on the Congressional Guide to the Federal Freedom of Information Act, which I'm sure I'm the only person in the room who knows anything about, so.
Other questions in the room or online?
What about resignation letters? I mean, I've been told recently that is exempt because of personnel information, because it's a reason why someone left. I've never run into that in any other state where a resignation letter is not public.
If they're just resigning and there's no discipline involved, then it's not public.
But if there is discipline involved, then the resignation letter is public?
Should be. Well, then we get into the convoluted management thing, and I don't know if you want to go there or not. It's different rules for people who are managers in state and local government, okay? If for example, the city administrator of East Podunk resigns while he or she is being investigated, and the investigation is final, the resignation letter is public. Okay, so it kind of depends. Another thing you can do is you can start getting other stuff. There was a thing a few years ago where a city or school district employee in Burnsville left Burnsville and got a huge $400,000 settlement. Okay. And so everybody wanted to know, because there'd been some allegations that she was doing bad stuff, how she could have got this settlement. Well, when finally somebody got the actual settlement, the settlement was a charge of sexual harassment by another employee, which then led you to be able to go look at the data about the other employee. Okay, but you never would have known that unless you could get the settlement agreement and look at it. So.
Josie, anybody else?
Anybody else online?
Is there a generic retention policy for certain kinds of data?
Oh.
That's a whole nother session. Retention policies.
But each agency has to have one.
Yeah.
So you can, that's a public record, and you can see what they keep for how long they're supposed to keep it. So.
And the approved retention schedules, and that's, the word approved is very critical, are on file at the Minnesota Historical Society, and they're online, okay?
For each agency.
For each agency.
For state agencies?
No.
Even local government? Okay.
Even local government. And if they don't have an approved retention schedule, then the statute that deals with retention says they can't get rid of stuff. The only way you can get rid of stuff is if you have an approved retention schedule, except in that statute, MaryJo, there is the word official, which is problematic. So.
Yeah, this one of the, there's probably those retention schedules trip me up a little bit more often than anything else, that it's just, I'm asking for old data that it's just beyond the retention window and I'm out of luck.
Well, and because of work like yours, more and more agencies are doing what the Department of Human Services is doing, which is telling its employees that effective some date this summer, any email that's older than 6 months should be destroyed.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Very-
email is where I've run into the retention problem the most.
It's a perpetual problem.
Last call for questions.
An interesting one.
Kim.
The State Board of Public Defense, believes that it is arm of the judicial branch and doesn't post any of its meeting dates, minutes, anything. There's no transparency at all.
What's the name of the office?
The State Board of Public
State Board of Public Defense.
State
And
Board of
I've
Public
asked
Defense.
Mark Anderson to look into it, but it just seems like no other agency is so under the radar like that.
If I remember, we've had this discussion other times. If I remember correctly, the final decision was, even though they said they weren't, they are. Okay. Because they're not a strictly judicial agency. They're created by statute. So.
Well, there's a whole rules of access to public court records of the judicial branch too, which.
Oh, but Jim, their position was they weren't subject to either.
Oh, okay.
Because there was some kind of special hybrid.
Oh, okay.
Not that they were subject to the judicial branch?
That's right.
Oh, okay.
Is there anything you can do for pending, sorry, this is a very specific example if anyone needs to leave, but the St. Paul City Council, I think they're having one right now, like a closed door meeting on pending litigation. Is there any information I can get on that? Okay.
No.
Last call?
What about data that has changed hands? So you see this with the court and the attorney's office, the county attorney's office, or last year I did this instance where there's enough evidence to show that the Waseca County attorney wasn't living in the county, and an outside investigation happened. They passed it off to local police. There's this back and forth, and I got sent down this rabbit trail of trying to get who the responsible authority was because it had changed hands.
When they contracted with the attorney to do the investigation, they were supposed to put in the contract a provision that says, you're doing this work for us as a government function, and therefore you are subject to the Data Privacy Act.
Well, that's got to be in the contract.
It's got to be in the contract, okay? If it's not in the contract, then things get murkier. We had a case about this a while back, which we sort of lost, and then we got a legislative correction that didn't totally fix it. But there are people, frankly, who make a living practicing law because they will say to a government agency, hire us to do all this nasty work you don't want anybody to know about, and we'll keep it secret for you. I'm kind of being nasty about that because it's one of those things I feel real strongly about because I've dealt with it over and over and over. Okay. So, but at some point, somebody is responsible. Okay. Yeah. If the data is there, then you can find ways to go after it. So.
Yeah, you see, it's my position that if you have custody of this data, it's in your hands and you should have to give it up. If you have it, unless you physically transfer it, I think this has happened with some of these BCA investigations where they say the body camera data from the police has actually been physically handed over. We don't even have access to it anymore. We've been given to BCA.
We see that sometimes with old court cases, right? It'll sit in court for a while and they'll actually physically send it back to the prosecuting court.
And then even the police department then will argue that it's actually no longer our data because it was through the court process. We've dealt with that several times. So.
That seems weird, though. They would keep those records in infinity, or however long they are supposed to.
All kinds of shenanigans.
Yes.
Yeah, there's some older commissioners' opinions on people trying to dump the kind of thing that Jim's talking about. And say, well, no, we didn't have to provide this data because we didn't keep it. Anyway, they're out there. I think they're helpful. So,
All right,
Well,
thank
thank you,
you,
MaryJo.
everybody.
Yes.